Bitch by Jason Bradford. Chapter 17. Nights on Titanic. Boris stood in his first-class suite. He looked down at himself as he stood alone, wearing his cotton one-piece full-body underwear. His heart was racing at the thought of meeting up with Victoria again. Since he had met her the night before, he felt something he hadn't in many years. A stirring. A need to be alive again and to simply exist. Losing Elsa was the reason that he hadn't felt real emotion since the night she and Abraham Lincoln was taken from the world. His immediate connection with Victoria alarmed him, but it also washed over him in warm currents of relief and a familiar happiness. Boris felt a slight pang of guilt. Elsa had never been able to experience anything this ornate or grand during his time with her. Now he was experiencing it with another woman, decades later. He grabbed his suit, the same one he had worn the night before when he met Victoria on the docking bridge. Filled with contentment, his stomach was full from his meal that was supplied by a chef who would have no recollection of serving it. Boris hadn't eaten in nearly 4 years. He hadn't been hungry. He had no reason to nourish himself. His loneliness kept him company, and he was growing weary of living. It was a curse that a vampire could never be destroyed. The novelization of the romanticized version of the actual truth promised that the demise of a vampire could be brought upon by the sharp tip of a wooden stake or a carefully placed crucifix. Those were just fairy tales that actual vampires wished were true. Part of the curse of living forever is that you really, truly live forever, no matter what. The universe could implode or explode, and the only thing left in the dark, empty, black matter would be vampires. The only thing that would end the existence of a vampire was his or her very own will not to live any longer. When a vampire had absolutely nothing left to live for, they would perish and finally meet oblivion. But the process of self-destruction took many decades, for some, even centuries. Boris had begun his process of self-destruction. His will to live had long been gone, taken when Elsa was never found. It was a slow process that plagued him. The evening was cool and wonderful. They strolled along the deck of the 880-foot ship. They talked about everything and nothing. Boris felt a comfort when he was with Victoria that he didn't understand. He wasn't sure he wanted to understand it, but he did know one thing. Victoria had saved his life by coming into it. "I hope I don't sound presumptuous or forward," Boris spoke softly, "but I was wondering if—" He didn't know how to finish his proposal of returning to his suite. He had no intentions of taking advantage of her, but he was afraid that she would suspect as much in any manner, just by asking for her company. "I'd love to," Victoria answered before Boris could figure out how to ask her. She could see the schoolboy's embarrassment on his face. She smiled. She felt as if she had been doing nothing but smiling since they met. Victoria held her arm out, and they locked grip at the elbows. They continued toward the closest entrance of the grand ship. They ran into only a few folks from the distance they walked on the deck to the grand staircase. To spare the looks of unease from those select passengers, Boris convinced them to forget seeing the two of them together. The grand staircase loomed before them. The double-wide structure was divided by a beautiful wooden and black iron handrail. A clock set high up on the wall in delicate and ornately carved wood was before them, and it reminded Boris how late it really was for the humans. To him, however, it was early. 11:25 in the evening was his morning, and his day was only beginning. The two of them stood near the clock, holding hands. "My stateroom number is E39, Boris told Victoria. "I'll see you there in an hour." "An hour," she confirmed with a smile and a subtle blush that warmed her cheeks. Boris leaned in and kissed her softly upon her blushing cheek. They parted ways for the moment, and he headed back to the direction of E39, eager to have her company for the evening. He felt a bit confused, as he had been known to from time to time. "Please, don't let me get lost on the ship tonight," he prayed. Tonight was not a night for forgetfulness and muddle-mindedness. Boris paced his stateroom, relieved he had found it. He sat in the green-lined chair. He stood and paced. He lay upon his bed, legs crossed at the ankles. He got up and paced. He was so nervous. He felt foolish for being so nervous. He looked around his room and felt a brief pang of guilt for having convinced the rightful occupant to take up residence with yet another convinced passenger who was alone in his second-class room. His room shook, and the floor stuttered beneath his feet. What had happened? Boris wondered. He lifted the curtain aside and was surprised to see icebergs reaching out of the water. There was a knock at his door. It was Victoria. His heart beat fast again. Again, he didn't understand the feelings he had or what they were born of, but he accepted them and embraced them. Boris opened his door with a smile. A young woman with pressed long black sleeves and a blindingly bright white apron stood before him. "Sir," she stated, "please put on your vest and make your way to the deck. Please make haste," she continued before darting down the hall and knocking on the next stateroom door. The deck was crowded, and everyone was in a subdued panic. While everyone held composure, the look on their faces told tales of emotions with horrifying storylines. The smell of their fear coursed through them as well. It was in their blood, that fear, and Boris felt pity for them as he pushed beyond each of the passengers until he would find Victoria. He realized at that moment that fear was coursing through him as well. He had to be certain that Victoria was safely aboard a lifeboat. He had only met her and already was devastated at the thought of being without her. He searched frantically, pushing his way past all the terrified passengers. Their fear penetrated into Boris, and the frenzied horror catapulted him into disarray. The smell of blood was no longer intoxicating. His head spun. Where was he heading? Screams grew louder. How long had he been pushing his way beyond the masses of potentially doomed souls trying to find Victoria? He was heading in the right direction. With the smell of fear so present, Victoria's own scent was lost. It wouldn't matter at this point who witnessed him change into a bat. He didn't even consider the consequences if he didn't convince every single one of them that they hadn't witnessed it. He needed an aerial view. Boris's suit fell empty to the ship's deck floor, and panicked passengers continued to scurry about, trampling the suit as if it weren't there. He was confident that everyone was too scared to witness something so fast as his transformation. It didn't matter anyhow. He flapped his wings and soared upward in a clumsy climb into the black sky. He fluttered about as quickly as he could. The entire ship was in sight. The bow was tipped down and submerged under the thick black ocean waters. The stern was lifted slightly off the ocean. The sight was unbelievable. A quick flash of auburn hair and a cream lace gown. He had found her. He flew closer to where she was and became a man again, nude. His physique was slim and toned. He quickly convinced a man to give him his top coat, and Boris pulled it on and buttoned it. It was long and covered most of his body. Victoria was standing near the railing where a small crowd of people were diligently working to free a lifeboat. He put his hand on her shoulder, and she turned around. She looked calm, not panicked. There was a sudden outburst of commotion. Two men were fighting and yelling at each other. They pushed and turned each other violently, causing a ripple of reaction. A young woman was shoved into Victoria, and before anyone could react, Victoria was gone, having disappeared over the railing. Boris rushed, not caring who saw his speed, full force to catch her. But he was too late. He looked down to where she plummeted, just in time to see her head smack wickedly upon the side of a lifeboat. Her neck wrenched to the side, and her head unnaturally bent sideways. Her body flipped before landing in the icy waters. He froze. The world around him fell silent and dark. Everyone and everything disappeared. He hovered above an abyss of darkness, which cradled the lifeless body of Victoria. Boris wanted only to exist in that abyss, to take refuge in its darkness. Thunder, loud and unbelievable, shook the ocean and filled the sky. Titanic had broken in half, just as he landed near the gaping hole where a smokestack once had been. Boris found himself running, not toward the waters or the crowd of the damned, but back into the ship as it tilted straight up. He decided to embrace the feelings of vertigo, disarray, and confusion of being thrown into a spinning ship, and he became a bat. He flew until he found himself in a large room where he became human. He sat naked and still upon the wall that had spun around, and it was now the floor. He surveyed his surroundings. He appeared to be in the first-class dining room. A man who had been trapped by a heavy piece of furniture was across from him, only a few feet out of reach. The man moaned and softly cried out for help as the promise of a watery grave approached. Soon, icy cold waters rushed in and engulfed Boris and the trapped man. Boris became part of the ocean. He became part of the Titanic and, with it, descended over 2 miles to the bottom of the Atlantic. Darkness within the stern was thick, but he could still see clearly so long as he remained in human form. His vision was sharp and unparalleled to any other living being on Earth. To see in ultimate darkness was a gift he soon learned was the second most valuable of advantages of being a vampire. To disappear in that darkness until his existence was snuffed out was the most absolute ability. The descent to the bottom of the Atlantic only took a few moments. The man trapped beside Boris had died rather quickly. At least, that is, he was dead before the immense water pressure pressed upon the man's body, forcing his innards up and out of his mouth. His eyes bulged out of their sockets, but never completely vacated the skull. Intestines dangled from the inside of his open lips and floated from the corpse, but were grotesquely anchored from his mouth. The ship was still telling stories of demise and destruction. Implosions, explosions, and creaking as the ship made itself comfortable in its new bed echoed throughout the stern of the broken ship. It was cold, and the bodies trapped within the belly of the beast would be well preserved for many months at the near-freezing temperature. But none of that appealed to Boris. It was time to end. The Titanic's surface was slick. The minimal salt content had altered the surface friction. Boris found his footing to feel odd and overly smooth, like walking on ice, but without fear of falling. The water pressure was heavy. Every inch of his body felt the squeeze of the ocean. It was a strange sensation, but painless. He knew that when the sounds of the imploding air pocket ceased, which he predicted would be in a few weeks, the silence would be friendly with him. Boris left the dead man behind him and made his way to the ocean floor, where he would begin his journey, walking to the bow of the ship. The ocean was silent. Debris from the wreckage surrounded Boris. Several bodies littered the seabed, strange-looking statues posed in peace, just lying there in their suits and wool dresses. The floor of the ocean was soft, and Boris sank into it upon first contact. He pulled himself up and familiarized himself with the strange new ground that swallowed much of the underbelly of the Titanic. Many moments later, and at the end of the current debris field, which was, so far, filled with wine bottles, personal artifacts, and dead bodies that rested in the dark, deep freeze, Boris could see the bow finally loom before him. He pushed onward. He was almost there. Almost home.